The Umayyads are the most controversial dynasty in Islamic history, and most of what is said about them is true. Karbala happened, civil wars were fought, tribal rivalry and factionalism grew. But the Umayyads were not merely about these things, because they emerged in the most critical century of Islamic history. On one hand, there was the dynamic, warrior, and tribal world of the desert. On the other hand, there were the ancient empires carrying the legacy of Rome and the Sasanians. The Umayyads tried to establish a state exactly between these two worlds. The first 40 years of Islam took shape in Medina, a world nourished by tradition rather than written rules, tribal councils, personal loyalties, the old balance of the desert. This simple structure was sufficient for the young society until the speed of the conquests changed everything. The decisions made between the mud brick walls of Medina suddenly began to rule the lands with the most deep-rooted state traditions in the world: Syria, Egypt, Mesopotamia. When the Muslim conquerors entered these ancient cities, they didn't just find new lands. They found tax registers, they found archive rooms, they found legal systems processed over centuries, and they found people who knew these systems, who spoke this language, and who knew how this machine turned. History was witnessing a rare institutional shock. It was no longer possible to govern this geography, where millions of people lived, different languages were spoken, and multi-layered economies ran, with a tribal balance, taxing Mediterranean trade, budgeting Sasanian irrigation canals, handling the logistics of a regular army. These were not issues to be solved in a mosque courtyard. The Islamic society was at a crossroads. Either they would melt away within this antique bureaucratic memory, or they would melt it in their own pot and establish a new model of sovereignty. This was not merely a matter of leadership. It was a total crisis of institutionalization, and the Umayyads were born exactly at this breaking point. They were the first dynasty forced to bring the world of the desert and the mind of the empire under the same roof. When Muawiyah bin Abi Sufyan moved the center of administration to Damascus, he found before him a continuous administrative legacy whose roots stretched back 1,000 years. For the architects of the new era, the issue was simple: not idealism, but permanence. In this direction, the Umayyad Caliphate made a choice. Instead of liquidating the warrior tribal solidarity of the desert, it fortified it with the palace splendor and deep-rooted administrative mind of Eastern Rome. This was a hybridization rarely seen in history. This new power structure that took shape in Damascus resembled neither the traditional chiefdom system of the desert, nor a simple imitation of Eastern Rome. Muawiyah, on the one hand, observed the traditional balances that would satisfy the tribal aristocracy. On the other hand, he mobilized the Byzantine bureaucracy, the tax system, and the administrative memory of Christian statesmen to govern his subjects. What emerged was a profound synthesis of the conquering energy of Islam and the ancient state tradition of the Mediterranean. For the first time, a religious movement truly met with an imperial mind. In 661, the Sasanian Empire had collapsed. But when an empire falls, the people who keep it standing do not disappear. Its clerks were alive, its tax inspectors were alive, its army commanders, palace advisors, irrigation engineers. They were all alive and carried what they knew. The Sasanian state was a 500-year bureaucratic memory. This memory lived in land registers, in the plans of irrigation canals, in tax tariffs, and in administrative traditions passed down through generations. The conquest did not erase this memory. It took it over. The hands of the Iranian clerks who entered the Umayyad palace had previously held pens in the Sasanian palace. The same hands operated the same system. The language had changed, but the mind of the state had not. The same process was experienced in the military field. The Sasanian army was one of the most advanced military organizations in the world. Cavalry tactics, the garrison system, border outposts, and logistics networks. These were a legacy shaped over centuries and tested on battlefields. The Umayyad army saw this legacy and took it over. The garrisons in Khorasan were established using the Sasanian model. The defense line on the eastern borders was built upon the old Sasanian outposts. Conquests did not only bring land, they also brought the military mind of the conquered civilization. In Damascus, the administrative memory of Rome was operating. In the east, the state mind of Iran was operating. The Umayyads saw both, used both, and these two legacies wove the first great institutional roof of Islamic civilization. However, this takeover was not a final destination. An empire could not live forever with the memory of others. The ledgers kept in Greek in Damascus, the tax records written in Pahlavi and Kufa, coins with Byzantine seals. After a while, these presented a major question to the Umayyads. Whose state was this? Were they the heirs of Byzantium and the Sasanians, or the founders of a new world? This question moved the Umayyads from the stage of imitation to the stage of establishing their own order. History recorded this transformation with the era of Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan. The breaking point first reflected on the currency. Until that day, coins bearing the images of Byzantine emperors or Sasanian shahs were circulating in the Islamic geography. The Umayyads melted down these coins and minted the first pure gold dinars, bearing no human silhouettes, only the words of Tawhid. This was a declaration of economic independence proclaimed to the antique world. Then it was the bureaucracy's turn. Greek and Persian, which had been the languages of the state for centuries, were banned. All divans, all archives, all correspondence were forced into a single language, Arabic. The poetic language of the desert overnight became the language of the complex bureaucracy, law, and tax system of the ancient world. The hands of the Iranian clerks were still holding pens, but no longer in their own language, but in the language of the new civilization. The system was Sasanian, the organization was Byzantine, but the spirit and the language now belonged to Islam. The Umayyads had not merely imitated the antique world, they had melted it in their own pot and built the backbone of a new civilization. And this transformation carried a faith movement that emerged from the Arabian Peninsula into a civilization stretching from the Pyrenees to Central Asia. Order could not be established solely in ledgers and coins. It also had to be established in the space the eye sees and the mind feels. The Umayyads saw structures that had risen long before them in the lands they conquered. The magnificent basilicas of Damascus, the majestic churches of Jerusalem, the 1,000-year-old stone architecture of Al-Madain and Palmyra. These structures were not merely made of stone. Each one was the antique world's cry of sovereignty carved in stone. Christianity and Rome were asserting their power through this architecture. Islam, however, did not yet have an architectural language. Mosques consisted of date palm trunks and mud. the simplicity of the desert was silent against this overwhelming visual splendor of the empires. The Umayyads decided to break this silence. The conquest of stone and space began. On the highest hill in Jerusalem, looking directly across at the Christian world's Church of the Holy Sepulchre, a monument rose, the Dome of the Rock. Then, in the heart of Damascus, on the very same sacred ground of an old Roman temple of Jupiter and an old church of John, the Umayyad Mosque rose. These structures were not built solely for worship. They were visual manifestos challenging the ancient world. The master craftsmen working in the construction were Byzantine. The mosaics decorating the walls came from the art schools of Rome. The engineering was the legacy of the antique Mediterranean. The Umayyads had taken over the technology, the masters, and the aesthetics of their rivals. But the resulting composition was entirely new. There was no picture of any emperor in the mosaics. No saint figure shone under the domes. The gold-leafed stones of Byzantium were now weaving the geometric order and paradise depictions of Islam. The architectural power of the ancient world had entered the service of the new order. The Umayyad mosques looked at the Byzantine churches and Sasanian palaces and said this: "We are rising with your masters, with your stones, with your aesthetics, but above you." The Umayyads had inherited the art language of the antique world and put it entirely into the service of a new world of meaning. The historical tragedy of the Umayyads was this: they established an empire, but they could not produce a common political belonging to carry that empire. They took over the most advanced institutions of the ancient world. They placed the bureaucracy of Rome, the state mind of the Sasanians, and the palace tradition of Byzantium into the service of their own power. But their political language still had not completely broken away from the tribal aristocracy of the desert. In the palaces of Damascus, they thought like an empire, whereas in the provinces, they acted with the reflexes of the old world. This very contradiction gave birth to the greatest fracture within the Umayyad order. The mawālī issue was the most visible face of this. Millions of people who accepted Islam were in theory part of the Ummah, but in practice, they were not equal. This silently growing tension ultimately led to the raising of another banner in Khorasan. The Abbasid Revolution was not just the fall of a dynasty. It was the explosion of the contradictions the Umayyads could not resolve. But history sometimes remembers what they left behind, not those who destroyed them. The Umayyads emerged from the desert, reached the center of the ancient world, took over its institutions, worked its stones, learned its language, and without realizing it, initiated the imperial age of Islamic civilization. They passed on, but the order they established continued to penetrate every state that came after them.